It's absolutely terrific for Carol and I to be back in Chicago again. We spent 10 years, the first 10 years of our married life here in Chicago. Our 3 kids were born while we were here in Chicago, so it's always fun to get back to this city. We got to see some friends we haven't been able to see for many, many years, and what a privilege being with Peter and Heidi Huizinga again. That was the first couple we ever met when we came to Christ Church of Oakbrook, the church that we attended during our years here. Also got to see Jim Phillip tonight, who provided these beautiful flowers, and Jim and his wife Gwen. Jim was actually a high school senior when we were here, and now married with 3 kids, one of who's married, so you can imagine that was a few years ago. But we're delighted to be here, and then you already met him, but to think that Rebecca and Erwin Lutzer are here, that is a special delight for me. I had the joy of being with them this summer at Camp of the Woods in New York. Erwin spoke so powerfully 7 times, and it was a joy to have him. And Sunday night, I had the chance of hearing him again at the Moody Church, and he said something that was so interesting. I'm just going to share it tonight. He took 8 words, and in 8 words gave the entire gospel message. You cannot do it better than this. He quoted Martin Luther. And what he said is what Martin Luther said. What Martin Luther said is, I am thy sin. He, Jesus, is my righteousness. Does that not sum it up in just 8 letters? But we're so glad that he's here. It was during our time in Chicago that I was asked to come into the NBA. I thought I'd tell a little bit about the story because it's kind of a fun story. People ask me all the time, how did you start in professional basketball? Just a normal question that people ask. And I thought I'd tell the story. And what makes the story dramatic is that my wife is not a sports fan. She could care less about sports. Pro athletes, as nice as some of them are, doesn't really do it with Carol. It just isn't a big deal. So here's the deal. I was talking to a man who called me on the telephone and said, I have the option to buy the Buffalo Braves. Now, you have to understand, most of you in this room don't even know that Buffalo ever had a basketball team. I think that's fair to say. Just to tell you who they are, in 1978, I moved the Buffalo Braves to San Diego. They became the San Diego Clippers. Now, you might now know that name. They're now, 2 years later, moved to Los Angeles, and now they're the Los Angeles Clippers. So that name you probably know. That was my team in Buffalo that I brought to San Diego. 2 years later, they came to Buffalo. But anyway, this particular person had an option to buy the Buffalo Braves, but he said he wouldn't come unless I would come to be president, general manager, and part owner with him. I was talking about it, interested to the point, but then what I did, I introduced 2 other people to him, thinking that they might be better equipped to go than me. He kept coming back to me, but I knew my wife wasn't really a sports fan, and I was going to have to kind of talk her into it. And you know how people like to be stable and have stability in your life? Well, let me kind of give you wives the situation and just see if you think this is an ideal time to move. We had just moved into a new home. We just finished the renovations. My father just passed away. I had knee surgery, and she delivered our 3rd child. Is that a good time to move or not? On top of that, she's from California, where the weather is so different, and Buffalo that particular year was having the worst weather in recorded history in America for a major city. At the end of the newscast in Chicago, they would say something like, Chicago has 3 inches of snow, but then the announcer would kind of snicker and say Buffalo was buried under another 20 inches of snow or so. And so I knew it wasn't really the time to talk to Carol necessarily about Buffalo. But finally, I did broach the subject, and what I said, honey, don't worry, we're not even thinking about it seriously, but I have been given an opportunity to consider going into the NBA. And the first thing she asked, a fair question, is which cities have NBA teams? Again, she wasn't a great fan, so that was a fair question. So I wrote out the 22 cities that had NBA teams. The first thing she did was take the pen out of my hand and cross off Buffalo. And even I knew that wasn't the optimum time. I mean, even I knew I had to pick my spot. That was not it. Well, finally, I couldn't hide it any longer, and eventually I had to admit that it was Buffalo. Well, the man who had the option's name was John Y. Brown, Jr. Now, John Y. Brown, Jr. lived in Kentucky, used to own a basketball team called the Colonels, the Kentucky Colonels in the American League, and you basketball fans will know what I'm talking about. And he had the option to buy the Buffalo Braves, and he asked if Carol and I would come down to Kentucky to meet with him. I told him I was interested, but Carol, I'm not so sure was, and I said, you know, with her just having a baby, me having knee surgery, maybe you ought to fly to Chicago, come to our home in Downers Grove. So they did. He flew to Chicago, met with us, and actually he met with Carol alone in the kitchen. And I was in the living room, and I thought, this is going to be fun. This high-powered guy who owned Kentucky Fried Chicken, who was going to marry Miss America, and who was going to become governor of the state of Kentucky, was now going to be in for a real experience, because Carol could care less about sports. They met in the kitchen, came into the living room, and I'll never forget what she said. She said, honey, I think we ought to go to Buffalo. I was stunned. I was absolutely stunned, but you need to understand in hindsight, without that commitment of her being totally sold on what I was going to do in that next era of my life, we would never have been able to create the Dallas Mavericks just a couple years later. It's an amazing story. But in spite of her encouragement, in spite of her support, which is really incredible, she never was a real sports fan. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples which will kind of help you before we get into talking about Koinonia House. Some of you who are football fans may know the name Raymond Berry. When they picked the all-NFL team for the first 50 years of the NFL, he's the starting split end on that team. He was best man at our wedding. Good friend, terrific guy, and I just found out that he had been named the head coach of the New England Patriots. I ran into the room. I said, honey, you will not believe it. Raymond Berry has just been named head coach of the New England Patriots. Now, you know, there's a lot of people that would be excited about that. You know what Carol said? Oh, no, why'd he do that? I thought he had a good job. Some years later, when we're in Dallas, it was the night of a game, and we actually were sitting in our seats, section 115, fourth row, near center court. We were there before the game, and it's rare I could ever get to the game before the game because I normally had responsibilities to do. But this particular night, I was there with Carol as the teams were warming up. Now, as they're warming up, they come to half court. Now, you've all seen pro basketball. You know how they turn around, they do the layup drill. But when they come to half court, their seat, we're so close to them, some of them would wave and say, hi, Norm, because they either played for me in Buffalo or played earlier in Dallas. You become friends after a while when you're in the league. It's a much bigger league today than it was when I was in it. But anyway, when I knew that my precious wife's head wasn't necessarily in the game, was a few minutes before tip-off when she turned to me and in all seriousness said, honey, who are we playing tonight? Now, we're there. We're in the stadium. The teams are warming up. It's not the morning of the game. In her defense, if it's the morning of the game, you can understand that. Some weeks you have 3 home games in a week, and it kind of, one runs into the other. No, this was in the arena a few minutes before tip-offs, and I remember I turned to her and I said, sweetie, just kind of as a basic rule of thumb, whenever you see 6 or 7 players in a row, and they all have San Antonio on the back,